Okay, and if we go to the webinar, so we have a very exciting speaker today. So Dr. Tempestt Neal from the University of South Florida, and she will talk about qualitative methods for biometric research. So exploring user behavior and system design. So that's it on my end with the intro. So I'm leaving the floor for Tempestt, who will take over with the webinar.
Sure, thank you both. Let me share my screen here. All right, am I in full screen mode?
Not yet.
Not yet. Let's see.
But we can see Tempest, so don't worry about.
Okay, you can't see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, perfect. All right. Let me go back to it because now I can't see it. There we go. Okay, so you can see it just fine.
Yeah.
All right. I apologize for not being able to get this in full screen mode. I don't know what's going on. We typically use Teams at the university, so Zoom is, for whatever reason, is still kind of tricky to me to use. But I'll just move forward with the mode that you can see. So thank you both for the introduction and for to the IEEE Biometrics Council for inviting me to do this. This was initially designed as a tutorial for IJCB. So due to personal reasons, I had to leave the conference early. And so I'm very excited to still be able to share this. And because it was initially designed for a tutorial, I do want to preface the talk by saying that I'm not necessarily going to share a lot about some of the projects that we're doing. It's more so a high-level overview of qualitative research design. And at the very end, I give some prompting questions on how we all can explore qualitative research design in biometrics. So I hope that that's useful. So just to give a little bit of background about my research areas, in the lab, we work on both quantitative and qualitative research design. We look at mostly mobile-based sensing for biometrics. We do some stuff with wearable sensing. And then we've also kind of applied my background in biometrics to look more so at human behavior understanding, using some of the same sensing technologies that we leverage in biometrics. Most of that work has been interdisciplinary, which has been very useful for opening up the lab and driving us down the space of looking at qualitative research. As computer scientists, we don't naturally pivot towards qualitative research, but in our interdisciplinary areas, some of our collaborators do that quite a bit. And so we've been able to work with them, learn from them, and then, just based on that, apply it to some of the things that we're doing in the lab. We also look at cybersecurity awareness as well, where we also apply qualitative research methods. So we're kind of having fun with looking at user perspectives and human-centered approaches in some of the things that we're doing. Now, I do want to say before I start that I do not claim to be an expert in qualitative research at all. I have some lab experience from years ago. And when I first entered a PhD program, it was in human-centered computing, where I was first exposed to some qualitative research. And it still just it's an ongoing development in building that expertise for me and my students. So this is not in any way a definitive approach to how you should approach qualitative research. But I hope that it does trigger some thought and some conversation around it, and maybe even perhaps some new projects. So the topics we'll cover, I'll first introduce qualitative research, some qualitative research methods for data collection, some data analysis techniques, and applying qualitative research in biometrics. I'll also cover some things on ethics and application areas as well. So what is qualitative research? It's a form of scientific inquiry that systematically uses predefined procedures. We want to collect evidence, collect data, and produce novel findings. Now, I know that this sounds like the typical quantitative approach, or the typical research approach, if you will. But what makes qualitative research kind of stand out is that we aim to understand a research problem from the population it involves. And a lot of what that involves is working directly with people in the community and talking to them and understanding their perspectives on a certain issue. So you don't necessarily, like we would do in quantitative research or biometrics, go in with any kind of preconceived ideas or a hypotheses. You frame the study around your research question, around your research topic, and you allow the theory to naturally evolve as you talk to more people. So qualitative research focuses on understanding the why and the how of human behavior, experiences, and interactions, and not necessarily the what, as I like to think of it in quantitative research. Qualitative research allows you to explore complex phenomena through open-ended inquiry. So with the open-ended inquiry, you have no preconceived ideas. You allow people to just express the way they want to. You allow them to tell you what they want to express. And then you analyze that data in a systematic way that allows you to draw insights from it without having any preconceived idea of what those insights might be. To do that, you can conduct interviews, focus groups, participant observation, case studies, ethnography, and so forth. In the lab, we most commonly use interviews and focus groups. So that's where I'll frame the discussion. Again, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to talk about something that we haven't used. But if you do have questions about them, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. And I have some awesome colleagues. I can forward it to them and try to get you some answers, and I can email it to you, no problem. So I wanted to kind of compare and contrast what the typical quantitative approach to biometrics looks like. We have a problem statement, we generate some research questions, we design the study, we collect the data, we may pre-process that data, we extract some features, we train a model, we evaluate, we deploy, right? Now, this has so many numerical components to it from top to bottom. The data collection, for example, is very quantitative in that we want to be able to use data that we can extract quantitative features from, right? Those features are numerical in nature. Even if you're looking at language, nowadays, the word embeddings are numerical in nature. The entire process of machine learning and AI is quantitative in nature. And even the way we evaluate our biometric approaches with equal error rates and score distribution plots and ROC curves, all of this is numerical, right? Now, on the other side of that, the qualitative approach, we want to understand subjective experiences. And I think that's the major difference here, where the quantitative approach to biometrics is usually centered on development. And we're trying to optimize some kind of technique in order to identify or verify an identity. Whereas with the qualitative approach, we're asking questions like, what are your perspectives on continuous authentication? Or what are people's needs when it comes to, I don't know, face recognition on smartphones, right? And so we're not trying to optimize the biometric system. We're trying to assess things like adoption and accessibility and usability and so forth. And what this requires is gathering narratives from people, multiple narratives, and analyzing that data in an in-depth way. I have immersive here because the researcher actually has to immerse themselves into the environment of the individuals that they're talking to. Even if it's a one-on-one interview, you have to be immersed into that conversation from the point where you first meet them to where you're actually doing the analysis. And so in that way, it's very exploratory. It's very flexible. There are no right or wrong answers. What people provide for you as the data can not necessarily be wrong, and it's not necessarily right. It's their perspective. And so the goal of the researcher is to pull all of that data together and to develop theories from that data. So some approaches that we've used in qualitative research, interviews is the kind of the number one thing that we've been doing. And we started this with a group in the College of Behavioral Sciences where we actually did a training with them to first kind of that first introduced us to qualitative research. And from there, we've kind of just been using it a lot more in our own studies. The interviews here are what people typically think of as interviews, is a one-on-one conversation with the researcher and a participant The idea there is to gain or gather deep insights into some research topic. There are 3 types of interviews you can conduct. A structured interview uses predefined questions. You don't really deviate much from the interview questions. You ask them as they are written down. The semi-structured interview is what we use more often. It's open-ended questions. You leave a lot of room for participants to elaborate. You leave a lot of room for the interviewer to ask you probing questions like, can you tell me more about that? Or can you explain what you mean by that? And then the unstructured interview is more of just a discussion. And it's very free-flowing in that way. So the advantages of interviews is that it is in depth, and there's that one-on-one correspondence between you and the person that you're interviewing. And so you're really gathering important information regarding their personal experiences. And you have the flexibility to probe deeper as well with the interviews. And another advantage here is that because it's just you and that person there, you can really just focus on their thoughts, right? You don't have to think about prior interviews that you may have already conducted. You're really focused just on that one person. Some challenges, though, is that they can be time consuming. You got to consider, for example, scheduling, making sure, or if you're going to do it in person, making sure you have somewhere to hold the interview, somewhere that's comfortable, and so forth. Importantly, you also got to have strong listening and probing skills. And this is something that does not come, at least for me, it did not come naturally. To kind of get at that, practice. It takes a lot of mock interviews for you to get to the point where you can, you're listening and you're also kind of taking notes in your head as you're listening. And so you can either respond in a way where you are reflecting that you heard something important, or you're asking important questions, or you're probing and so forth. And so the interviews here require some training in terms of listening and probing. We've also conducted some focus groups. Now, to me, these are much harder to do, but that's just my opinion, and others may disagree. A focus group is a moderated group discussion involving multiple participants. So somewhat like an interview, but you have multiple people there. You typically have a facilitator. You may have 1 or 2 facilitators that moderate or lead the discussion. And then you'll also have a note taker that is taking notes as the discussion is going on. Some advantages for the focus group is you do get that group interaction. And if you recruit in a certain way, if you sample in a certain way, you also get diversity in perspectives. So if you wanted to study people of different age ranges, and you decide I'm kind of going to have, a younger person, middle age, and maybe someone older in a single focus group, you get that diversity in thought. And sometimes what you'll notice is people will start to kind of bounce ideas off of each other. They're not even talking to the facilitator anymore. They're just talking to each other. And that's a great thing, because then you know that they develop that trust among each other, and you can really get some valuable data once that happens. Some challenges, though, is just managing. I have dominant voices here, but really all voices, where you have some people that they don't have much to say, or they may be shy. You may have some people that are not mean, they just may be a little bit more aggressive in how they communicate. And so managing the dynamics so that everyone feels comfortable can be a challenge. And that also leads into ensuring that everyone contribute. You don't want to have someone just kind of taking over. Scheduling and coordinating have been the hardest 2 things for us, simply because I think with COVID, what happened is everyone got used to doing things online. But we've noticed that focus groups are so hard to conduct online. You miss that body language, and you miss having that personal interaction, not just with you and the participants, but participants with other participants. And so scheduling and coordinating people to come in person has been incredibly difficult. I'm still waiting to figure out what's the solution to that. But the focus groups work well if you can get them all together, but that has been a pain point for us. Some other qualitative methods, these are our methods we have not used. They include participant observation, case studies, document analysis, ethnography, narrative analysis, and content analysis. I have I would say, a developing knowledge of these techniques, but again, we haven't used them. And they provide different tools for interacting with people, either in their natural environments or as written materials, or personal narratives or stories that people tell, or even visual content. So there are different ways that you can observe, essentially, and gather qualitative, subjective data. So developing a research question. This piece is severely important, I feel, in research in general, but especially in qualitative research. So a well-formed research question in general defines the research purpose, defines the appropriate methods you want to use, it guides the study planning, and it frames the analysis and findings, right? And this is for all research studies. But I think what I've learned with qualitative research is that the research question has to be sufficiently defined, right? So there's a way to structure the research question, which is, not to me, it's just a formality where you begin with the verb, you identify the topic, you use neutral language. But these last 2 points are so important, where you have to define the sample and setting, be precise and feasible. Now, to me, these are super important because with the quantitative approach to biometrics, you can almost be a little bit more broad in your research questions because you may have more resources available to you to explore them. So if you wanted to look at self-biometric classification with some element of privacy or some element of, I don't know, generative data or something like that, you could potentially fit that into a single study because you may have multiple data sets, you may be able to integrate multiple models, and so you're able to explore all of these things. Whereas with qualitative research, the broader your question is, the harder it is to analyze the data that you get from doing your interviews or your focus groups or whatever you're going to do. The reason for that, and these are just, again, this is just my opinion, is that the subjective nature of qualitative data is already going to give you something, give you a set of data that could be potentially all over the place, where people experience things in different ways, and so they communicate them in different ways. So if your research question is not clearly defined, where you have a single sample, a single setting, and it's very precise and it's feasible, you may have people commenting on things that work on the outskirts of your research topic, but not necessarily hitting on what you really want to focus on. So it's very important that your research questions are clearly defined. So again, you need to start with a verb, identify the topic. The language should be neutral, identify the sample and setting, and ensure that it's feasible. So if we had something like this, the purpose of this study is to understand user perceptions, challenges, and adoption of biometric recognition for authentication. To me, this is very broad and very big. It's a big problem, right? You want to know the perceptions, the challenges, and adoption for biometric recognition and authentication. So there's really no setting here. And who are the users, right? So who exactly do you recruit? But you can refine this and you could say, to explore challenges faced by visually impaired users in adopting mobile-based facial recognition technologies for authentication. To me, this is more clear. We start with the verb, to explore. We know exactly who our sample is. We know what the setting is. And this is a lot more feasible in terms of setting up the study and defining the study than the original version. Now, the interviews. So the purpose of qualitative interviews is to engage, your interviewee in a one-on-one conversation that allows you to gather their personal insights, right? Now, the semi-structured interviews is the most widely used version. That's the one where you have your interview guide, but it's very flexible. You can probe, you can ask them to expand on questions, and it leaves ample room for natural conversation. Now, the semi-structured interview is typically conducted once. In our studies, we've never interviewed anyone more than once. And in the literature, they can last from 30 minutes to several hours. Our interviews typically last about 45 minutes to an hour. So the first thing you want to do is identify your research question. And you would do it the same way as I just discussed. It needs to be sufficiently focused so you know exactly who you're recruiting, and you can build your interview guide based on those research questions. Recall from the slides previously that the first original question was very broad, and it would be very hard to develop your interview question guide based on that original question. But adding in who are the people we're going to sample, what is the scope of the problem, adding that detail into that question allows you to clearly define your interview guide, which is severely important. After you have your your research questions, you want to identify who are we going to recruit. And your research question should help you do that. If it's not in the research question, you need to revisit step 1. So you determine the target population. One thing that we've noticed in our studies is 2 things that are severely important. You want to recruit people that are available, and you want to recruit people that are willing to do the study. Reason for that is people drop out is a real thing. People will drop out, or they may come, but they may not really participate. And so you want to, and I don't know the answer to this, how do you identify people that are, but you want to find some kind of way to recruit people that are excited about the study just as much as you are. They also need to be able to articulate their experiences in a reflective manner. And what that means, at least the way I interpret that, is if you want people to think about something that happened in, I don't know, the 1990s, then you need to recruit people that are able to think back that far. You know, something as simple as that. Or if you want to recruit people that have experience with face recognition from the point where it was first introduced on smartphones to now, then you would want to recruit people that were using face recognition when it was first introduced. So they need to be able to reflect. They need to be able to participate within the scope of the research study. You want to purposely sample to maximize the richness of the data. So that might mean diversity in gender, diversity in age, or so forth. And focus on individuals that are especially knowledgeable or experienced with whatever the research area is. So designing the interview guide should reflect the research questions. What we've done is actually put the research question at the top of the document, and then we build the interview questions based off that. And I kind of stole that technique from, I can't remember the name, but it's I can't remember his name, but he's an expert basically in qualitative research, and it helps tremendously because it keeps you grounded, and it doesn't allow you to kind of deviate much from your research questions when it's always there. But importantly, be prepared for your interview guide to evolve throughout the study. That's one of the things where I mentioned the open-ended questions and the be flexible and be exploratory. You will go back and forth with the data that you're receiving from interview to interview with your interview guide and your research questions. If you notice that, okay, what people are talking about is not really reflecting our initial research questions, we got to iterate on them. You will actually you may have to revise that interview guide, and that's a normal process. Is constant analysis of the data and the interview guide, the data and the interview guide, and you go back and forth, back and forth. Now, this is different from quantitative research where we design a biometric system, we analyze the system, we report the performance, right? Here, you literally go back and forth between what are the results so far and what are we asking? What are the results so far and what are we asking? And you iterate on that interview guide. So step 4, you want to prepare for the interview. You want a comfortable location, something that's convenient for your participants if they have to commute there. Schedule it in a way where it's convenient for the researcher and the participant, and also do some training. You know, we've done mock interviews for practice, mock focus groups, and it helps a lot. And especially if you're going to have your students doing something like this, be present during those practice sessions and take notes, and give the notes back to them. And even if you need to do another one, do another one. You can never do enough. Be prepared to adapt the questions as needed, which means you have to be overly familiar with the interview guide. You may see that as people are talking during the interview and they're getting comfortable with you, that they start to really elaborate and really, be expressive about what they're discussing. And what might happen is they may respond to a question that was like one of your last questions. And so you have to be overly familiar with the interview guide in order to make those necessary adjustments. So you're thinking, okay, I won't ask this, I'll adapt that question, or I can just, leave that question out. But the only way to really do that naturally is that you become married, if you will, to the interview guide. Now, before you start and you've practiced, you develop your research questions and your interview guide is solid, submit the study for human subjects research approval. That's really important. Basically ensuring that the study is ethically sound, that you're not asking anything that would, cause any undue harm and so forth. Once the study is approved, then you're ready to recruit. So as you're conducting the study, ensure that the setting is comfortable. check your recording equipment. We typically use a couple cameras and a voice recorder, just because the cameras allow us to get body language, and not necessarily, we don't necessarily use the cameras for audio, but more so for body language. And then the voice recorder is for recording the actual exchange. From there, you'll transcribe the data, and you can use whatever transcription service is available to you. But please note that if you're not doing it manually or finding something that's free, these typically have a cost. So budget in when you're just defining your study, make sure you have budget for transcription, budget for paying your participants, even budget if you need to rent a location. You know, these are things to think about. Or if you want to have like coffee or something, budget that in as well. So with the data analysis and reporting findings, I have some slides later on about analyzing the data. But your preliminary data analysis often coincides with the data collection. What that means is, as you learn more about the subject, you learn more by analyzing those transcripts. You may realize my interview questions are not soliciting the information I need to address my research questions. So you may have to go back to your interview guide and refine those questions a bit. All right, so let's move on to focus groups. So focus groups aid in understanding social norms and diverse perspectives within a community. Essentially, it's an interview, but with more people there. And so you're interviewing multiple people at one time. You may have 1 or 2 researchers engage in the interview. We typically will have 2, one being the facilitator or the moderator, the other being the note taker. Typically 5 to 10 participants per focus group. 6 to 8 is preferred. We also aim for 6 to 8, but for scheduling, due to scheduling conflicts, we've been struggling with that. Your focus groups usually last 1 to 2 hours. 90 minutes is common in the literature. And another thing to keep in mind is that the presence of non-participants, such as a faculty member, may inhibit open discussion. So the first few focus groups I would attend because I wasn't thinking, you know, and we were recruiting students that, you know, they may feel a power dynamic there that may make them uncomfortable and, you know, less willing to share. So moving forward, I stopped going. And that's something you want to think about, even if, you know, you're not recruiting students, if it may be someone that you know personally or something like that, just be sure that, you know, you don't have any unnecessary people in the room because it could inhibit conversation. So I found this figure from an article that reviewed 170 articles on biodiversity and conservation. So it's not in biometrics, but I thought it was interesting because it reflects the typical recruitment approach that you see. So the group size per focus group was about 10 people. Total sample size is about 52. On average, the number of focus group studies was 7, and they lasted about 90 minutes with equal representation of male and female participants. So I thought that was, you know, useful for 170 articles to kind of be within the range of also what I've read as kind of the standard in some of the computer science literature. So designing the focus group guide, just like the interviews, you will have a guide, which is your list of questions that you want to ask. You, excuse me, you want between 8 to 12 questions. You can label them as 5 or 10-minute questions, and it's very useful because it helps you keep an idea of where you are with time, where you are in terms of, I have, you know, these set of questions left. I may need to, you know, kind of push the conversation along. The focus group guide typically starts with some opening. It's very broad, very general. And then you move on into the introductory questions, which more so start to pull people into the topic at hand. Then you transition from the intro to your key questions. The key questions is where you're asking like the core questions that are specifically driven from the research questions. Now notice that there are not a lot of questions here. Like you may have 2 to 5 key questions here, but this is intentional because I've noticed that with focus groups, the conversation tends to last a bit longer than with interviews because you have multiple people there. And even on a single question, your participants might start to talk to each other, and that extends the time. And so you don't want a lot of questions pending that you never get to because of that extensive conversation. You want your focus group guide to be conversational, clear, use simple language. You may have to define things in a way that you wouldn't typically define them. So if you would have a question that, I don't know, you would use on an exam in a biometrics course, you may want to simplify that language so that the general population can follow. We've also found it useful to put questions like on a screen nearby and just click through them as the facilitator goes through them. And it's especially useful when people start to talk to each other and the conversation may be extended. People may forget exactly what the original question was, so it's helpful to do that. You want to avoid asking why and ask instead to describe how, and be aware of time limits. So I'm sorry, be aware of limits, and that includes time, attention span of your participants, language barriers, of course, and even communication skills. So I mentioned that you typically have two people at least at a focus group. One is moderating or facilitating the discussion. The other is taking notes. The moderator's role is to create an environment that is calm and welcoming to the participants. You want to encourage them to provide detailed responses. You absolutely want to avoid yes, no answers. There's no analysis that can be done on those type of questions. Lead the discussion, ask the questions from the focus group guide. And you may also have to, think about follow-up questions and probing when you notice that, participants may have something else to say, but they're not really saying it, or they mentioned something, but it's not very clear. And so what you want to do is listen actively and know when to ask probes. Don't overly probe because then it becomes excessive, but know when to ask probes and which probes to ask, right? So you can say things like, can you tell me more about that? How did you feel about it? Why did you think that is? And so forth. And these things allow people to clarify their thoughts or allow people that are not, maybe being as active in the focus group to speak up a little bit more. The note taker role is severely important. They're responsible for taking comprehensive notes and capturing key details. They can even capture things like body movement and note periods of time in the focus group where participants were very passionate about what they were talking about. Another thing too that note takers will do is manage the logistics. They may have to go let someone in if the door locks, or I don't know, let people know where the bathroom is, or manage things like giving out snacks or something like that. But essentially what it is to, what they're doing is managing kind of behind the scenes so that the moderator can always be actively listening, right? And know when to probe and when to follow up. What you want to do when you're taking your notes, it may be helpful to create a note-taking form if that helps you stay organized. Use shorthand and abbreviations because people will speak quickly and people will bounce ideas off of each other very quickly. And also distinguish between your own thoughts and participant comments because you don't want your thoughts to be factored into the data analysis. Then following your focus group, you may have a debriefing session conducted immediately after the focus group when everything is still fresh on the moderators and the note takers' mind. You want to note things like nonverbal communication. I mentioned before, the note taker might jot down when someone was being overly, passionate about something. This allows you to capture fresh impressions that may be lost if you don't capture it right after. This is also a good time for you to figure out which questions didn't work well. Because remember that the qualitative approach is very fluid, where you can go back and make changes so that moving forward, you can gather more insightful data. You can also discuss new topics that came up. This is a big one where you may say, I didn't even think about that. And so you might want to add a question to reflect it to get other people to elaborate more on that as the story continues. All right, so data analysis, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking quickly, I'm trying to get through all of my slides. I had a ton of slides for the tutorial and I had to shrink it down. So to analyze the data, after you conduct your interview and after you conduct your focus group or whatever other qualitative study you're conducting, you typically end up with a transcript of that data. So the video data that you may collect, it might just be useful for you to kind of, reflect on what was said, how people behaved, but you may not necessarily use it for the data analysis. Typically, what we do is take the voice recording, transcribe it, and then that's what we use as the data. So the data analysis generally consists of an iterative review of individual and group level codes. So a code is a word or short phrase. I prefer short phrases that represents the essence of data. Now, the way that we do that is we literally look at the transcripts line by line, and we try to develop a phrase or some kind of word that captures the important components of that line. So this entire process of doing the entire transcript and multiple transcripts is called coding, which is what we do to develop a code structure. The code structure, which results from coding, is all of your codes put together. You have definitions for them, which is really important because you want to make sure that if I conduct multiple focus groups, I remember what this code meant, even if I defined it from transcript 1 and now I'm on transcript 20, for example. You also want to track your quotes. So the line by line, those lines are just going to be quotes from the transcript, what people actually said. Track them and associate them with the codes. It's important for reporting that in your papers. You may also have subcodes, which expand on the main codes. And you may also have some guidance on when and how to use the code. And that can be helpful if, for example, your research team changes in the middle of the study. So some methods for developing a coding structure, the first one being inductive grounded methodology. This is the one that we typically use, where we work from the ground up. We don't have any preconceived ideas. We don't start with a preliminary framework, which you would in the start list methodology. In that case, the researcher may have some expertise and can generate a set of codes that you start with. The integrated approach is beginning with some broad, fluid ideas, if you will, and developing codes from that. We typically start from scratch, where we take the interview guide, the interview transcript, every line is coded, and then we constantly compare from code to code, transcript to transcript, even researcher to researcher, and we're trying to develop a theme that can derive, or a theory that can derive from that code book. So the iterative coding process, this is what it's looked like for us so far. We read each transcript first. We create a set of initial codes by looking at the transcripts line by line. We code 2 to 3 at a time. We negotiate with the team members. So everyone codes the same transcript individually. This could be 2 to 3 researchers, and meet up and we discuss, okay, how did you code this line? How did you code this line? And there may be agreement. And typically when the first time you do this, even if you agree, the codes may be different just because you may set something a different way. But if that's the case, you just decide on, okay, what are we going to call this code? But they might also be different, be very different, and they may mean something totally different. Now, if that's the case, it requires some negotiation between the researchers to decide, okay, how do we want to code this data in a way that captures what this person is saying? Sometimes that means going back into the interview, or sometimes that means reading further into the transcript. But whatever it requires, essentially you're negotiating exactly what people are saying. You're trying to capture it in a way that you don't interject your own opinion, and you try to capture exactly what they were trying to communicate. At the end, you want to target approximately 8 to 10 codes. Your codes will tend to merge over time. You'll realize that, these two are kind of saying the same thing. We can merge them. And the code should importantly inform the primary research question. We use what's called constant comparative analysis to do this, where we compare, I think I mentioned this before, your data segments or your transcripts with other transcripts, your codes with other codes, categories of codes with other categories, and even researcher to researcher. And what that allows is you're able to make sure that you're not missing anything really, because everything is being compared, and it's a tedious process. It's very time consuming, but it's worth it, because if you just rely on one researcher, or if you just code based on one transcript, or you rely on one set of categories without ever reflecting on, what if this would have changed, or what if in the next interview, this person was kind of saying the same thing, but we coded them differently? Your code book is going to be probably much bigger and much harder to interpret. But on top of that, you're not really capturing what the participant was saying, and you're not able to draw conclusive insights because you haven't considered similarities and differences across time. So constant comparison is a key qualitative research method that stems from grounded theory analysis, and I'll talk about that just a bit in a second. And it is an iterative coding process, similar to what I've mentioned before. Oh, here it is here. So we compare within and between. We compare between interviews. We compare between time, demographics. We may look at men versus women. We may look at people with and without experience with face recognition systems. We ask, how are they different? Are similar concepts expressed in the same way? And even the collaborators, are we achieving diversity in how we interpret the data? So ideally, you want to have 1 to 2 researchers analyzing the data to have that diversity in thought, right? You don't want people that think exactly the same, or just one person coding the data, and that allows the data to be more holistic in the way that the analysis to be more holistic. So a guide to constant comparative analysis, it may look something like this. You collect the data. You don't have any preconceived theories. You're just collecting the interviews or the focus group data. You convert them into your transcripts. And then the open coding phase is where you identify and categorize the data. The focus coding is where you synthesize, so you're trying to find the significant categories. The axial coding is where you're looking at relationships between those categories. And then finally, you can develop those relationships in those categories into a cohesive theory. So notice that we're not going from theory to the data, we're going from data to theory. Now, that reflects grounded theory, which is an approach to qualitative data that stays very close to the data. You want to construct theories grounded in systematically gathered and analyzed data. And the goal there is to generate a theory that offers an explanation based on data that emerges during research. That's the important part. An explanation based on data that emerges during research. That can't happen if you go into your interview or your focus group studies with some kind of preconceived ideas of what's going to come out of that. Because essentially what you're doing is going into it with a theory, and now I want to try to prove that theory, or I don't know, provide evidence in support of that theory. But what qualitative research kind of forces you to do is go in with an empty slate, with a blank mind. You have some kind of research objective, some kind of research question, and your interview in focus group or whatever study you're conducting is going to provide data that leads to some theory to explain or to answer that research question, and not the other way around. So to me, sometimes it can be a little bit challenging. I've noticed that some of my students, they have a hard time wrapping their mind around that when they're first doing this type of research, because we're so used to saying, okay, I have this hypothesis, I have this idea, right? I'm going to develop my study around this idea, and I'm going to develop my study to support this idea. Whereas on the other side of that, with the qualitative approach, is there is no idea. There's some kind of complex phenomenon that I want to be able to explain, but I have no idea what that explanation might look like. And I'm going to talk to people and engage with people in order to figure that out. And from there, I can generate a theory that offers some explanation. So some core components of grounded theory might include sensitivity, theoretical sampling, the coding process I just mentioned, saturation and integration. Essentially, you'll see that these highlight some of the coding practices that I mentioned before. So the researcher needs to be able to define data patterns, know what's important in the data, collect data and do the analysis simultaneously. So remember, we're going to go back and forth between the data and the data collection and the analysis. So the saturation refers to when you're able to kind of stop your study. And that's when no new insights are found, right? The categories are well developed. They are robust. They describe everything so essentially people are starting to say the same things over and over. Your analysis is leading to the same outcomes over and over. At that point, you reach theoretical saturation. And then from there, you can create a cohesive theory by integrating all of your codes and your categories that you develop throughout. All right, so applications and ethics. So I have just a study here to demonstrate a use of qualitative research in the biometric area. In this study, they were evaluating face biometrics as a replacement for CAPTCHA systems. They used 87 participants were recruited. They looked at CAPTCHA, drag and drop, and then the face biometrics. And they were assessing perceptions and acceptance of these different approaches using interviews and questionnaires. And so there, I just wanted to highlight that there is ongoing research in biometrics that's using qualitative research. But after a search, a quick search, they're not, it's just not many. So there's very limited publication, especially in some of the venues that we publish in, like IJCB, for example. And essentially, studies generally just don't use qualitative approaches. And I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with that, but I'm hoping that, maybe we can see some growth in the use of qualitative research in the area. Another thing to consider is that qualitative research, the way that we were kind of introduced to it as a lab is through some of the interdisciplinary research that we're doing and some of the research that we're doing that has a human focus. So some of the human-centered AI approaches that we're using. So this is one study by one of my PhD students. He conducted a qualitative study to look at the feasibility of using AI for supporting at-home care. And this study was an interview study with caregivers. We've also used interview studies for studying the use of applied biometrics in mental health applications. And I've noticed that there's more room for exploration in these kind of interdisciplinary areas. And so if you're interested in this could be a way for you to really integrate qualitative approaches into your research by looking at some of the interdisciplinary and applied areas. So a short bit on ethics. So ethics in qualitative research involves ensuring the dignity, rights, and welfare of participants. Essentially, what that includes is consent. They need to be aware of the study. They need to know every piece of the study and how they'll be involved. Confidentiality, how will you protect their privacy, and minimizing harm. Now, these are crucial for the credibility of the research. It's just like designing a data collection for, I don't know, a new face recognition system where you need to go through the human subjects protections protocol in order to ensure that the people you're going to bring in to collect that data are aware, they're not experiencing any undue harm, and then they are providing consent to participate. So participants must be fully aware of the research purpose, the procedures, the potential risk, exactly what they're going to be doing. They shouldn't be forced to provide consent. Then they need to understand that they can withdraw at any time. This is going to be everything that they do should be because they volunteered to do it. And that's really important. So here's just a sample consent form that we use at the university. This is just the first page. And you can see we have to describe the study staff, the details, who the participants are, why are we asking them. Importantly, that they are volunteering their participation. We cannot make them do anything. There are no consequences if they decide to drop out, benefits, compensation, risk, and so forth. Researchers must also protect participants' identities and personal information. Now, I do think that as working in the area of biometrics, this is something that we're very used to doing, especially when we collect data, we'll use pseudonyms or codes to represent who the participants are and not their actual identities. And so this is something that's probably natural for people working in biometrics. Importantly, too, is secure data storage and making sure that only the researchers have access to that interview data. Minimize any physical, psychological, or emotional harm. If your interview guide or your focus group guide includes questions that could be triggering, you want to say in the consent form that that could be the case. They need to be aware of that before they decide to sign up. And you also need to articulate how you will try to mitigate that. Finally, treat participants with respect and consideration. If they can't show up, still thank them for their consideration of the study, and invite them to come back another time. Don't be angry with them, and just acknowledge the fact that people are doing this because they want to and not because they have to, and be appreciative of their time. With the once you have all of these things worked out, typically you'll submit your study to an IRB board, and they will review the study and make sure that it is an ethical study before you're able to conduct the study. Once you have their approval, then you're good to go. So just some final thoughts here. Some common criticisms of qualitative research include things like you can't reproduce it, it doesn't generalize, there's researcher bias, and then sometimes CS researchers feel that qualitative research may not be as rigorous or as scientific. And I kind of get some of those points, but I think ways to combat that is to just be very, very clear in your articles and to be very meticulous in detailing every step that you take. What I've learned with qualitative research is that you can't really reproduce it because you're getting that, that subjective personal feedback. And it's not going to generalize because I don't think like other people, right? And so that's a normal part of qualitative research. Now, it may generalize among the population that you're recruiting, but only maybe to a certain extent, or only maybe to certain people that live within a certain region or something, right? And then the researcher bias, just be very clear about how you're analyzing the data. Did you use multiple researchers for the analysis? Did you use something like constant comparative analysis and so forth? And so to address that, be very clear in your articles. How did you know you reached saturation? What did your interview guide look like? We will literally include the entire interview guide, and you'll see this in a lot of papers as an appendix at the end. How many coders did you have? What software did you use? There is software to aid in the qualitative analysis approach, but essentially being extremely detailed helps to communicate that this was a rigorous study. Qualitative research is very rigorous and is very time consuming and is very tedious, and you have to be careful about how you're analyzing the data. So just a few questions here that I have at the end is what are some things that I can do in terms of qualitative research in the biometrics realm? So just some questions here. What are some biometric systems where understanding user experience is critical, right? So if you can ask yourself that about some of the things you may be developing, could you use qualitative insights to improve those systems? Can you use qualitative methods to improve the design or the user interface of those systems? Who do you engage? Like, what do your stakeholders look like? And what types of feedback do you need from them? And maybe another question, what ways can qualitative research reveal cultural, social factors that impact the use and adoption of systems? So you can get at things like trust, are they familiar with the technology, social values, and so forth. And I think I end there. So thank you all very much for your time. Here's the QR code if you want to download the slides. And I welcome any questions at this point.
Thank you very much. Please accept our virtual claps for your engaging talk. I will let Vito read you the questions. Vito. Okay. You're muted, Vito.
So thank you very much for the talk, Tempestt. It was very. Thank you. So there are some questions coming up in the Q&A section. So the first question by one of the anonymous attendees is, so what are the benefits of qualitative research over quantitative? I assume most of the audience here has a computer science background, I would imagine, right? Sure. We are used to developing algorithms, test algorithms, and then report performances. But with qualitative research, you're answering different types of questions, right? You are. Yeah, you're answering questions related, at least in our experiences, we're answering questions related to the user's experiences. So you may develop use a continuous authentication system, for example, on a smartphone, and you may decide to see how it performs in the real world.
And one way of looking at that could be, you know, performance. Does it perform well when people are in different environments? Does it perform well when people are experiencing, I don't know, different phenomenon? Or if it's a face recognition system, when they're expressing different things on their face, for example. And those are very much algorithmic questions, right? But you may also ask questions like, you know, is it convenient for them? Did they abandon the technology? Did they stop using it, and why? And so these kind of questions where you're trying to get at the user's perspective is where qualitative research can come in. So it can be very beneficial at targeting those kind of, you know, questions and problems, whereas the quantitative approach typically does not.
Okay, thank you. So
Sure.
there's a question from Alan. What type of incentive do you offer to recruit participants? So is it monetary? And are your participants typically students, or do you go out into the world community?
So we typically offer gift cards. And if the focus group is in person, we also offer food because students love food. So we've had Panera Cater, and we provide, I think at that time it was a morning session. So I think we provided like a light breakfast. But we typically do provide gift cards is typically the way that we go. And we use a service that allows people to pick any gift card that they want. That's been pretty useful too. If you just have one, like, you know, you get a Target gift card or something. Everyone doesn't shop at Target. So even that variety, you know, just thinking along those lines has been helpful.
So is it actually, how difficult is it to get like a representative focus group or participants for your interviews? Because I would imagine, right, you specify what type of demographics you want, but at the end, it's very challenging to recruit exactly those demographics. It depends on availability, on the time, on other factors as well. So can you maybe comment about that, about your experience on getting the right demographics or the structure of the focus group you for example, planned, and then what you actually are able to achieve or to recruit with?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vito. What we've noticed is that what we want and what we typically end up with are like totally different. We typically know exactly who we want to recruit and how many of those individuals we need in the study. Now, because the studies are approved, we don't deviate from the inclusion criteria. So if we're recruiting, for example, I don't know, people that are 30 years old to 40 and they must work in transportation, I don't know, making that up, then we can't deviate from that without approval from the institutional review board. But what we find some challenges is if we want 50 people, we may get 23. And that's because I think, again, one of the challenges has been getting people to be involved in person, which has been so much better in getting us data. But I think I just feel like you know, the last few years has really just pushed people away from wanting to move to do things in person. You know, it's become a challenge. And scheduling time, you know, my students, they have other things that they're working on, and some of them are still taking classes. And so coordinating their schedules with participant schedules where these people may be working and, you know, during work hours they're not free. So it can be a challenge. You just have to be persistent, you know, and we've even had recently to change the study from focus groups to interviews because the focus groups were just not working. It was so hard to recruit. But again, once the study is approved, we don't change the criteria. So we have to keep pushing for who we're recruiting. We do that in different ways with flyers around campus, around businesses local to campus, email blast. We're going to start printing out little postcards of the flyers and putting them in the student center to get people to see it. We also put flyers up on the TV screens in the student center. So you have to get creative and so that people can see it. Another thing that we've done, if your university has like a newsletter or something that goes out to the students, ask if you could put your recruitment material in that newsletter as well, because students typically, at least here at USF, they tend to read them.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question from Emanuela. And in what scenarios is nonverbal communication, for example, facial expressions incorporated into the process?
What was the first part of the question?
So how frequently and in what scenarios is nonverbal communication incorporated into the process?
nonverbal. And so I would assume that that question is asking, do we use like facial expression as a part of the analysis, maybe?
Probably, yeah. So if you record that during the interviews, for example, or
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
so
So in our qualitative work so far, we have not used things like facial expression. The reason for that is we don't put the camera, unless we're recording, like unless it's online, if it's in person, the cameras are like, we put 2 to 3 cameras in the room and they're not necessarily like in people's faces. So the cameras are just there as like backup in case the voice recorder goes out. And it also provides information about like a general body movement and, you know, making sure we know who was talking to who so we can label speakers, but not necessarily to capture facial information. Now, you could do that. You could definitely do that if you're doing like a online interview and, you know, you are recording the screen. That's possible, but we haven't done it yet.
Okay. So Erzam is asking, I guess it's about the coding process that you use for the transcriptions. So how would we know when to stop the coding process? I imagine new themes and codes may appear later on in the observation stage.
Yes, that's a great question. So we stop once we reach what we call saturation. And that's when, and again, you will not analyze the data once you've done all of your interviews, right? You'll analyze it. So we tend to analyze the transcripts after 2 to 3 interviews are done. And then we will analyze that data, do 2 or 3 more, analyze that data. And what that allows us to do is see how the data is evolving over time. And you may realize that your codes and even some of the quotes are kind of being consistent after a certain number of interviews. At that point, no new information is being derived in the study, and we call that saturation. And that's when we typically stop.
Okay, interesting. So there's a slightly longer question from Augusti. So it's about ethics. Provides a scenario. So imagine that you want to test whether a placebo, a sugar pill, affects the mood of participants. You give a fake pill to all participants, but then you create 2 groups in one, and in one group you tell them that they had to give a real mood enhancer pill, while the other group you tell them that you don't know whether they have a real pill or a placebo. In both cases, you're sort of lying to the participants because telling them the truth will reduce bias and so on. So is lying to participants acceptable in this kind of?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that's something that would be determined by the Institutional Review Board. I know that there's verbiage in our IRB documents about being deceptive. And I can't honestly remember if it's acceptable or if it's not. That would be a question for your human subjects board, where you, and in our experiences, our IRB board is totally okay with us just reaching out to them before we even submit a study and ask them, you know, what would this look like? Could we do this? Could we do that? And so I think that, you know what, now that I remember, we did conduct a survey study a couple years ago, and the survey presented people with a fake kind of warning that the article they were reading was generated by AI or generated by a journalist. And our goal was to see, what we wanted to see was if people believed the article based on who they thought it was generated by. And at the end of that study, when they were done with the survey, we had verbiage in there that said, that basically explained that nothing was generated by a journalist, nothing was generated by AI, it was all generated by the researcher. And so we had to explain that we were being deceptive, but at the end, we had to tell them that we were being deceptive. So given that, I think it is possible. It's definitely possible, I think. But I would still consult with your institutional review board to determine exactly how you have to present it to the participants.
Yeah, of course. So I have maybe one last question.
Okay.
You were talking about transcribing all the recordings that you have, which is a very time-consuming process. Also, doing all the coding and with multiple researchers, right? That takes a lot of resources. So is there room for AI technology in that? You know, so these days we have LLMs which can process text, natural language, and so on, very efficiently, a lot of information. So is there room for tools like that in qualitative research?
Yes, of course, it is. We use a service to automatically transcribe our interview data. And the only thing is, even, and I would think this would also be true if you're using like LLMs or something, you want to make sure that you go back and listen to the recording and read the transcription to make sure that it's accurate. That's the only thing. So it is time consuming to do it manually. But what we do is we do it using an automated tool, and then we go back and we check. And typically it's just a few things that it got wrong and we have to adjust, but you absolutely want to make sure that you check, because the transcript is the data, right? It is the data source. And so you want your data to be accurate. You want it to reflect what people said. So there is absolutely room to use those kind of tools. We use them, but just make sure that you verify that the transcription is correct.
Great. So thank you very much, Tempestt, for taking the time to give this talk at the webinar, for answering all these questions. So the talk, what we usually do is we post it online on the YouTube channel of the council, so it's accessible also later on, also for the audience, and we'll send the link, or we'll share the link, so everybody can then watch the presentation offline.
Awesome.
Thank you again, so for a great talk, and thanks for everybody for joining. And with that, I'm closing the session, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.